we kind of have a huge tragedy playing out every day in developing countries. Anyone who has been following news in Peru finds that there has been quite lots of ongoing political crisis. The learning outcomes in public schools start to improve quite steadily. It's poorer than Argentina, poorer than Brazil. There is this huge gradient of inequality. I think the government is not in a great shape to govern. You basically have a country that contains several worlds.
Give me a background into what the educational environment looks like in Peru pre the 2010s, so the period before what you were looking at in the piece of research.
Right. So it didn't look very good. So let's start with some basic things like schooling results. Something that often is referred to is the PISA test carried out by the OECD. And in 2009, PISA, Peru was one of the worst performing countries that were included in the test. Of course, not all countries in the world take this test. It's mostly richer countries but some middle-income countries. But it was there very near to the bottom. Then if you go and actually look at what's going on in the school system, we would certainly see huge inequalities. Inequalities primarily in the urban versus rural setting. So in urban settings, you would have another layer of inequalities because in urban areas, about half of the children were attending private schools and half about public schools. And then in the rural setting, you have mainly public schools, which are also clearly worse resourced. So there would be significant problems with school resources. Most of the schools would need some work to be done on them in just basic resources. And in rural areas, you might not have electricity and things like that. And of course, the further in rural areas you go, the more dramatic it gets. So you get into areas where the resourcing is very poor, accessibility is very poor. And we would also have a fairly static system of teachers. So teacher salaries would have been declining in real terms for quite a while. So in 1970s, the teacher salaries were still pretty decent, but they sort of declined all the way to 1990s and stayed quite low in 90s and early 2000s. And with the equivalent skills than teachers, you would be earning 40% more doing something else than teaching. So the teaching career was not appealing. Most of the teachers were relatively old. The results were poor. There were huge inequalities in the system. So I would say those would be some of the key items in Peru at that time.
No, it's interesting actually because you brought in the regional disparities there. And actually, when I was looking at just some of the statistics for Peru, generally speaking, comparing it to maybe sort of India or the UK or wherever, it seems that actually Peru is actually quite a I don't know what the word is, but it's not particularly densely populated as a country. It's much below the population densities of, definitely India, but also the UK and a lot of other countries around the world. And you brought up there these differences between urban centres and more rural areas. I think that's actually a part of like some of the other research that you've done in regards to Peru as well. Is that a part of the reason why the educational standards seem to be so low, despite it being kind of like a middle income country, just because maybe it's quite sparsely populated potentially, given the population and the size of the country?
It's part of the problem. It's not necessarily the main reason, but if we look at Latin American countries in general, and Peru is a very good case of these. In some sense, when you move from the center of the capital city towards the periphery, you go through different worlds, if you like. The center of the capital city might look like, you're in Southern Europe or even a North American Spanish-speaking city. And then when you go to small towns, you see that the buildings are quite, simple. quite poor looking. And then, as I said, the further you go, you essentially enter jungle where people no longer speak the same language. They might not speak Spanish. They have indigenous populations living from the land. So you basically have a country that contains several worlds, completely different worlds, which is not like what you'd experience if you travel around a country in Europe. And I mean, if you're trying to administer an educational system in this country, if you're the education minister or one of the bureaucrats, you have quite a lot on your plate. So there will be challenges in terms of just getting things transported somewhere, having teachers willing to go to rural locations, for instance. So essentially, it's not only teachers. So you basically get better teachers in urban locations.
Hmm.
Teachers who are usually educated are avoiding the rural areas. The school infrastructure, likewise, is a lot better in urban areas than in the most remote areas. And finally, of course, the parents and the population also differ. So you generally have the most educated people in urban areas, who have resources, who invest in their children's education, and who have, of course, have an incentive to study because all the modern jobs of industry and services are in cities, whereas in the rural areas, all you have is mining or agriculture, and you basically have poorly educated parents with little resources and not necessarily any incentives to study. So
Sure.
basically, everything works to increase those rural disparities.
Yeah. And it sounds like you get a lot of these like agglomeration effects of just because the resources pooling around an area, you get more facilities and things like that also kind of facilitate some of this divide as well. So going to the research obviously in question, you were looking at obviously this period in time in which Peru massively ramps up its public spending on public schooling. Up until this point, to your point, as you mentioned, public schooling is not particularly great. The overall educational standard is not that high. Private schooling is obviously much higher, but it's obviously much less sort of widely available. And then you go through this period in which the country is massively ramping up its investment within the public sector of schooling. Could you just outline for me what kind of programs, facilities, or what kind of stuff are they investing in during this period?
Okay, so there was a lot going on. So we're looking at the period from about 2010 to about 2016. So it's about a window of 5 to 6 years when a lot happened.
Mm.
So they rolled out a number of things. Let's start by school resources, for instance. They had programs to improve school resources, and the weight of that effort was probably in the rural areas. They did a lot with teachers. So, for instance, they started to hire teachers in a new way. So they basically wanted to make the teaching profession more meritocratic and more attractive for new people. So basically, the teacher salaries were increased. The selection of teachers was based on competitions. There were scholarships given to people who want to study pedagogy in the university, so that they would basically have their studies paid. Um, there would be sort of a meritocratic promotions of teachers. So previously, your promotions, your progression in the teaching career was mainly based on your age and tenure. But now there would be a possibility, basically, pass a certain kind of test once in a while and notch up your pay and get promotions faster if you're able. So more meritocracy, better selection of teachers, and then also concrete incentives. Like they have this program called Bono Escuela, whereby for instance, if your school performed better than average on some metrics like learning outcomes, enrollment, retention, if the school was in the top, I think top 30% of the region or something, the teachers and the headmasters in that school all got a quite hefty bonus. So there were quite concrete incentives to basically notch up your metrics in these schools. And also there were improved systems for tracking the schools. So sort of information systems where they get monthly reports on if something is broken, something is missing, um, and some school visits as well. And that's not all. There was also improvements in the school curriculum. So the school curriculum was redeveloped, including more new things, more variety. For instance, PE, more English, um, and they got sort of standardized teaching packages that they could use, which were harmonized. Um, and also importantly, the school day was lengthened. So they often had schools where they only taught half the day. So it basically was made a standard that the school day is a full day, and that also, of course, makes a big difference as well. So there was a large set of reforms that sort of attacked the school system from all directions, trying to
Yeah.
improve it, and those sort of rolled out over several years.
Interesting. But it sounds as though it's definitely focusing more on the incentives, but also the intellectual capacity of the institutions. For example, it doesn't sound as though they were building these massively new, fancy, high tech schools or anything like that. It sounds as though they're focusing on the curriculum, they're focusing on teachers' pay, incentives, meritocracy, all to try and stimulate greater growth in educational outcomes. So it seems to be a focus on that, or even KPIs and reporting. Data. So it sounds to focus on those things as opposed to some maybe the full physical infrastructure things.
Yes, and I think that's basically the direction you should also take if you look at the literature on what sort of things might or might not improve learning outcomes. There's quite lots of accumulated evidence to show that school resources don't seem to be really the thing that improves learning, whereas there's quite a bit of evidence that teachers matter. It's not always clear what's the right thing to do with teachers, but it's been shown in many papers that some teachers are clearly better than others and create more value added for students. Um, but essentially, this points to the fact that you should think about teacher selection, getting the right people, getting competent people, and getting most out of those people is really important. So, in some sense, education really it shouldn't be rocket science. There's the students and there are the teachers, and they need to be capable and motivated in imparting the information on younger generations.
No, I get it. Certainly, when you put it like that, makes it seem almost like a very simple way to approach it. Just before we get into the sort of kind of the results of the research, what is Peru like? I mean, we talked about some of the inequalities there up until the 2010s, but could you maybe just give me a comparison maybe to what the other sort of localized regional Latin American education systems are looking at? Are they quite similar to Peru? Are they quite different? Do they have different outcomes? Is there a different mix between private schooling, public schooling? Are they quite similar or are they quite different?
Well, probably there are more similarities than differences. Some of the similarities are that you have in Latin America in general, you have quite large private sector.
Hmm.
So it's very common that in the urban areas, middle classes opt for private schooling. So that's very common all across Latin America. What you also have quite a lot in Latin America is these massive differences between urban and rural areas, and also quite lots of segregation at all levels. Um, in Peru, it may be that the segregation is even somewhat worse
Hmm.
than in the other Latin American countries. And one thing that maybe also is characteristic of Peru is that the private sector is quite unregulated. So the sort of regulations around private sector, how to start and manage a school are quite, or as I've understood, are quite liberal. So and that sort of manifests it in a self that manifests itself in, for instance, in a way that there are lots of very small private schools that are often just they could be like a family enterprises where
Okay.
some parents decide that hey, we're going to start a school, and they hook up with some other parents and they start a school. They find premises, and they basically get the local people who trust them to teach their children. Um, so in some sense, what you see if you look at the data is that there is this massive amount of very small private primary schools. So even if you take a very small area of 1 square kilometer, it might have lots of schools in urban areas. So it's really, especially the private schools are very small, very unregulated, and there's huge amounts of choice.
Interesting. Almost sounds like there's more competition, but it sounds like it's less regulated than, say, a United Kingdom, maybe in America, where there's sort of much
Absolutely.
bigger institutions that sort of feed sort of larger area. Got you. So Peru goes through this period. They recognize they want to spend more money and more investment on public schooling and improving it. They go through the things we talked about, updating the curriculum, investing in teachers, reporting, helping teachers pay and whatnot. What are the outcomes of that? What happens to what are the effects on the educational economy? And how does it differ between private school, public schooling, and in the general environment?
Okay, so what happens in Peru is that the learning outcomes in public schools start to improve quite steadily from about 2010 onwards. Um, and they improve quite dramatically in a sense that if you look at the early 2010s, there's quite a big gap in urban areas between the private schools and public schools. So the private schools, on average, um, do a lot better when we look at the national tests that they carry out there. So basically, what Peru does is that it actually has very good system of testing children. So they test children in grade 2 in all school types. So you have a very good sort of comparative data set for that. They do also some testing at higher grades, but it's a bit more scattered. You don't have such a clear sort of time series for every single year. But
Okay.
for grade 2, which is the data that we mostly use, you see that there's this quite rapid improvement in public sector, to the extent that by 2016, the public sector catches up with the private sector in reading, and in mathematics, it actually exceeds the private sector. So, quite rapid improvement in the learning outcomes, at least in grade 2. Now, you might say that, okay, that's grade 2, and can we really trust these numbers? They're coming from the Peruvian system. Is there somebody, cooking up the numbers or
Okay.
something? But if you look at PISA, which is the international OECD test, which is carried out on older students who are 15 years old, you also see quite good improvement there. So, talking of PISA, they basically had quite poor results in 2009. And in 2012, which was the next PISA, that's when they had a dramatic moment in Peru. Basically, Peru scored the last out of 65 countries. So the
And
results came out
that's
in
what stimulated this
partly.
effort here.
Yes. So I mean, in 2000, so this was basically PISA carried out at the end of 2012, and in 2013, at the end of 2013, there was a new education minister who had just been in his office for about a month, and they get the results that you are now the worst out of 65 countries tested globally. And of course, the newspapers are blasting that we are the worst, and the picture of the education minister there. What are we going to do now? And I mean, of course, the good thing with this is that this was the time when education got all the attention. Education rarely makes it to the front pages of newspapers in any country. But being at the very bottom of PISA was a sort of a PISA shock for Peru,
Hmm.
and undoubtedly that contributed to the public awareness of the poor state of the education in Peru, and probably helped to rally the political momentum behind education, which is always very important. If you want to get anything done in the government, there needs to be political sort of consensus behind it and the resources. So yes, we saw the improvement also in PISA, not just Peru's own tests, and yeah, very significant. But we should also say that I should emphasize that not all of the improvement is necessarily down to these reforms. So now it's very easy to say that okay, there were these reforms, and the results went up, so it must be the reforms. But if you look at this thing a bit more carefully, you also see that some of the learning improvements already started a few years before the reforms really kicked in.
Okay.
So and basically there may be some explanations to that. For instance, we know that the cohort sizes were reducing, so the numbers of pupils were reducing in most of the schools. But since the teachers had a contract for life, they didn't really kick out any teachers nor reduce the school numbers. So in practice, what you saw is improving pupil-teacher ratios across the country. So the same teachers, less pupils, so that means more attention per pupil from the existing teachers. Also, at the same time, you had a growing economy, which meant reducing poverty. So as you have quickly reducing poverty, we'll have parents with more resources, potentially better nutrition for children, more educational investments within home,
Hmm.
and also urbanization. And as you urbanize, you of course move to an environment from rural areas where you just have the agriculture and mining to urban areas where you start to think that, what sort of job would I do? Perhaps I should educate myself. So it's possibly also an increased demand in education.
Sure.
So, what I'm just emphasizing is that um, there were lots of reforms, lots of important reforms, and some of those reforms have been evaluated by other researchers, not me, but other Peruvian researchers, and they have shown that those particular components of those reforms did improve learning outcomes. But not all of it is due to these reforms. There were also underlying factors, economic growth, reduction of poverty,
Yeah.
and such things.
Yeah, and that makes sense ultimately. If children have more resources, they're not going to school hungry, they can focus more, their attention's better. Sounds as though that ratios between students and teachers are improving anyway, and that's obviously always going to have better educational outcomes if teachers can spend more quality time with each individual child, as well as just having more economic resources at home, being able to
Yeah,
bus maybe to the right schools and all that kind of stuff as well. So these reforms seem to have contributed a very significant amount to these educational improvements, but just not the whole amount by the sounds of it.
absolutely.
What I was interested though, when I was reading the article, is that what I would have expected the outcome, at least with as the difference between public schooling and private schooling in this regard, is that because more money's been pumped into the public school side of it, I would have expected potentially results to go up. I wouldn't have necessarily expected private schooling results to go down. Because ultimately, just because you're investing more in one thing doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, these institutions are private, right? And so they're sort of relatively insular in that regard. But from what reading your piece, it seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, that educational standards and scores at the private schools seem to go down. It's not just that the public schooling scores went up. I was hoping you could just elaborate a little bit more on this because that doesn't necessarily jive with what I would have necessarily expected.
No, I agree. So, I mean, basically, what we do in the paper is the main aim of the paper is to see what happens in the private sector schools when public results improve immensely. So of course, what's going on is that the parents in urban areas are making a school choice, and they're essentially choosing between a bunch of public schools and private schools within their vicinity, wherever they live. And we were mainly interested in where, what happens in the market dynamics. Will people start to switch back to the public sector as the public sector improves? And we indeed do find that. So our main result, if you like, is that as the public sector improves, we'll see that the number of pupils in private schools is declining. So that's if you like the main result, the main market reaction, that the public sector is winning the market share back. And the backdrop why this is sort of interesting is that all around the developing world we basically have this process in by which the public sector schooling is eroding. So you see essentially urbanizing middle classes simply abandoning the public sector. And in some sense, that is very common in developing emerging countries. In that the public sector is failing, public services is failing. It's not only education; it's also healthcare, and there are other symptoms like tap water. You can't drink the tap water. So, and in some sense, this is a sort of a feature of development, sort of almost like a characteristic feature of a developing or emerging country is that the public services aren't functioning as they should. They're not delivering. And we wanted to look at, firstly, whether that can be turned around by improving the public sector. And we see that, if you improve the public sector quality, people move back to public sector. But coming to the point that you were specifically asking, that we found that in private sector schools, we also saw some decline in results. And that's true. It's quite unpredictable what really happens in the private sector schools when public sector improves. Now, unfortunately, our data doesn't really have the means to unpack why we observe a decline in private sector results, because we don't have precise enough data to look at what kind of students leave the private sector and what happens precisely between with the teachers in the private sector schools and other things. Of course, there are lots of unobservable things. So even if we get the register data on schools, we might see, how many teachers they have, how many students they have, and some features of the school resources, but we don't really know what's going on inside them. How is the management functioning, and so forth. So when we see the private sector results declining, there could be some possibilities. One possibility that we tried to examine is whether there's a selection of pupils. Is it the case that the better students are leaving the private sector schools to go to public sector schools? And we have some ways of looking at that, and we don't really believe that's the case. Because in our data, when we ever see pupils leaving the private sector to the public sector, they tend to be pupils from relatively poorer households, and who are also doing relatively poorer in the tests. So we don't really believe that it's better students leaving the private sector. Something that has been suggested to us is a possibility that as the teacher salaries in the public sector increased, it could be that the public sector actually poached teachers from
it's
the
pulling them
private
across,
sector.
maybe. Yeah, they were strong enough incentive to bring them over.
It's the similar teachers choosing jobs, and if suddenly the public sector starts to pay a lot more, I mean, the public sector salaries increased in real terms by about 50%, maybe.
Oh, big jump
Quite
then.
substantial.
Big, yeah.
Yes. And the private sector, small private sector schools don't necessarily pay very well. Remember, these are very small shops. I don't know what kind of margins they have. It could well be that they pay very poor salaries.
Yeah.
So it's possible that the public sector was able to get better teachers, or poach some teachers from the private sector. Or it could be something else. If private schools lose students, they are losing customers who pay fees, so they might need to cut corners somewhere else. So if they can't lower their fees or higher their fees, they might need to drop off some other things that affect their results.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It sounds as though they really put like a lot of money then in terms of the. I'm imagining the budget that they had as a government for public education must have been quite significantly improved. Do you have any information on what the government spending and what the commitment was over this kind of time frame, what kind of spending they had at the beginning and what they ended up spending.
Yeah. Okay, so the time before the reforms, the Peru was spending about a bit under 3% of the GDP on education, on public education. Now, 3% of the GDP is nothing extraordinary
Hmm.
in this sort of type of country. So if you look at countries that are middle income countries, you'd probably see something like between 2 and 5% of the GDP being spent on education. So 3% is perhaps there in the lower end. And over the period of time, that increased to about 4% of GDP. So that looks like about a 33% increase per GDP. But remember, at the same time, the economy was growing. So the budget itself was
Oh
growing
yeah,
as
of course,
well.
yeah.
So if you look at the actual
Nominal
number of
amounts.
the nominal amount of money, you will see that the education budget increased about 75% over about 5-6 years. So that. Of course, that's without counting inflation. So if you
Yeah.
count the inflation off, it goes down a bit. But nevertheless, nominally, within 5 years, 75%. It's quite big. It's quite big.
Yeah, no, that's it. It's really significant. And this would be a little bit of postulating, but and we're probably a little bit too early on. Although I guess this was started in the 2010s. Has there been any effects on the wider economy? Obviously, we've had about maybe 15 years since the start of these policies. Has there been a market improvement in Peruvian productivity? Has there been higher educational outcomes? Are they getting improved sectors in things like service sectors, maybe that are like, a little bit more, require a little bit more education and stuff like that, a little bit more value adding compared to maybe sort of primary and secondary sector jobs? Or is it maybe quite hard to tell considering that the economy was really starting to grow beforehand by the sounds of it anyway, and so it maybe just gets a little bit muddled up?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit too early to make an assessment
Sure.
like that. I think a complicating factor is, for instance, the COVID period, the pandemic period, which really hit the education system in Peru very hard. So I think Peru had the longest periods of school closures
Oh, really?
during the pandemic. So, I mean, in some sense, that, I mean, our analysis, everything we do stops to about 2016,
Yeah, right,
2019.
right before,
So
yeah.
we are really looking at the period before the pandemic because then everything was
Cool.
squeezed
Yeah, yeah.
upside down. I mean, what I've read is that the private sector lost even more pupils because the private sector wasn't able to deliver,
Hmm.
and obviously the parents don't want to pay school fees if the private schools
Well, if the
can't,
kids aren't going, yeah.
yeah, can't provide any teaching. So you'd have even more moving people to the public sector. Of course, the results crashed because of long school closures. The economy suffered immensely. Of course, it has made a bounce back like it
Sure.
has everywhere. But Peru is one of these countries where lots of the economic growth is coming from mining and agriculture. So, I mean, these are not I mean, generally the sort of a high tech industries which are driven by education. So, lots of the sort of wobbles in Peruvian economy over the last 20 years have been down to something like prices of raw materials, prices of agricultural exports. So, um, it's too early to say. But related to that, it really should be emphasized that there is a very solid literature in economics that shows that these learning outcomes matter for economic growth. So if you do a larger set of countries and you look at what are learning outcomes, sort of exactly the sort of measured learning outcomes and skills that are measured by international test scores, how do they affect economic growth? And the results are basically showing that it's exactly these core skills, core numeracy, core literacy, that affect the productivity, affect economic growth in the long run. Not the years of education. It's not that you sit in the school because the school quality might vary. You might not learn anything. And it's a sort of it used to be a sort of a paradox in the literature that if you try to predict economic growth with the years of education, it was sort of there and there. Sometimes it produced something, sometimes not. So it wasn't very robust. So why isn't this human capital doing anything for growth? And then when people started to look at these actual test scores, which are measuring concrete skills, then that's where it was very clear. The relationship between that and economic growth is clear. So it is very good for Peru to improve those core skills. It should be for the future.
Certainly. And it sounds as though, obviously, we've talked about the improvements in the aggregate educational outcomes. But obviously, at the start of this conversation, we were talking a little bit about the regional inequality and potentially some of the inequalities maybe with other regions. Did this public sector increase and improvement in education also mitigate some of the regional inequalities potentially as well? Or has it mostly been, these improvements mostly been resigned to the more city or urban areas?
Um, let's say that if we look at some of the school resources, uh, we see more rapid improvement in the rural areas. So we see the sort of some measurable school resources, how for instance, how the schools are resourced, improving a bit faster in rural areas. What you also see, another good thing that you see in rural areas is that because the schools are quite small and because there is quite lots of migration from rural to urban areas, the pupil teacher ratios in rural areas have been improving quite rapidly. So, in some sense, you have again reducing pupil numbers, but you have the same teachers there in place, and that improves the pupil teacher ratios. Now, then when you look at learning outcomes, you sort of uh, you see improvement everywhere, both in urban areas and rural areas, but the gaps still remain. So you can't say that the rural areas would have caught up in a very significant way. Perhaps a little bit depending on how you measure it, but I would say that everybody benefited, but the gaps are still there.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And obviously, we talk about some of the improvements there, and at least in the modern day, it's probably, you probably don't have a great answer for me, given COVID pandemic and resurgence and all that kind of stuff. But at least in comparison to the other Latin American countries in the region, is Peru outstripping or outpacing some of the other countries in the region in terms of education, or is at least maybe it's closing the gap? Because obviously, by the sounds of it, it was ranking last, at least in 2009 or something. So is it maybe at least closing the gap on some of those other countries?
Okay, so it has actually. So it has. So it used to be worse than Argentina, for instance, and Brazil, but now it has caught up and even surpassed about just about Argentina and Brazil in reading and mathematics. Uh, Also, Colombia, I think, is pretty much in that league. Then there are Latin American countries that are doing still better than Peru, like Chile and Uruguay. Then, if your comparison point is the OECD countries, um, we could say that um, let's say that about around 2010, there was quite significant gap between the average OECD country and Peru. And let's say that Peru has caught about in reading, no, in mathematics, about one quarter of the gap. So Peru is still poorly performing in international context, but it has caught up about about 20% or 25% of the gap in mathematics, about maybe 17, 18% of the reading gap. So it has caught up with the rich countries a little bit. It's still poorly performing by global standards. And within the Latin American context, it has clearly improved from the sort of poorer performers to the sort of average performers.
Got
And by the way, while still being relatively poorer, if you look at the GDP per capita,
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
it's poorer than Argentina, poorer than Brazil, but it's doing equally well. So actually, it's actually looking pretty good.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think I was looking at some of the GDP per capita at PPP figures. I think it's about $6,000 to $7,000 per person per year, which is obviously not one of the poorest in the world, with the likes of Uganda and some of
Yeah.
the other places. But it's certainly, I mean, to be honest, it's even for the middle income, it's still certainly on the lower side of that as well. So considering the improvements in educational outcomes, I think it's obviously probably done quite well, actually. Is there something that you identified or you think that Peru needs to do as like the next stage of its development? It's probably quite hard to tell given the pandemic and all these other factors that have influenced it. But is there something that Peru now needs to focus on to keep the momentum going forward in terms of educational outcomes?
Okay, so let's say that this probably uh, uh, is a difficult one because Peru has had quite lots of political turbulence lately. So anyone who has been following news in Peru finds that there has been quite lots of uh, sort of an ongoing political crisis, changing governments, changing presidents, corruption, um, unrest, demonstrations, violence, political paralysis, and I think um, it's difficult to govern effectively when you have political paralysis or political upheaval in the country, and that has been a very persistent feature in Peru. So, in some sense, if we look at this reform period, which was a couple of governments basically from about 2011 and 8 years onwards from that to 2018. So we're looking at really two 4-year blocks, which happened to be two governments when it was relatively stable politically. They had economic growth and they had the political consensus to invest in education. That's what created lots of action, lots of good results. And since then, with the pandemic and various political turbulences, I think the government is not in a great shape, not in a great shape to govern or improve the country in many other ways. So I think uh, what they need to do is somehow sort out their politics, really. And this is a common pattern around the developing world, in the sense that often the development problems are ultimately political problems.
Yeah, so it's really downstream from the macroeconomic and the political factors facing the country. So realistically, in order to continue pushing on and developing the sort of educational base of the population and all that kind of stuff, it's really more down to the macroeconomic and the political factors that are really going to influence it. To your point, obviously it's the stuff that they've implemented, the initiatives that were beneficial, but there's also a big underlying point of it was also getting more like economically growth and vibrant throughout this
Mm.
period as well, which maybe released percentages and extra income to be able to actually spend on these kind of things as well. So it sounds as though
Mm.
it's probably going to be down more to some of these sort of more
Yes,
widespread
but
factors.
yeah, but nevertheless, something that I think is one of the takeaways, sort of a big picture takeaways from our paper and things like this, is that there are these. They show that things can turn around. It's not like countries are destined to stay poor and dysfunctional. There was a period when things functioned really well and results improved and things were done. So the question is, can we do this again? And Peru itself has seen a period when things functioned, and they will remember that, and surely they can get back to that. It's in the living memory, and
Shows it's attainable.
um, exactly. And remember, most of these things, most of these development problems, whether we're talking about education, health, tap water, as I've said, they are not rocket science. It's basic governance, basic engineering, long-term investment, monitoring, correct incentives. Um, all countries have access to all the knowledge that is needed. It's about getting organized and having a sort of a maintained, sustained push to and sort of a political will to fix it. And if that sort of will is developed in the political class, in the ruling class, and the people who hold the purse, and there's some tailwind from good economic growth, things can happen.
Right. And actually, on that point, then, is there a piece of research that you would like to see conducted in the future, or maybe whether in this specific area or potentially in one of these other related areas, that you think would most effectively capitalize on the findings of your research?
Well, I think something that is interesting in the big picture is that um, this sort of privatization development that we see in developing countries and middle income countries is a really big trend. So and we don't quite yet know or have very good idea of what it does. So what I'm saying is that when we have this erosion of public sector, we kind of have a huge tragedy playing out every day, huge human tragedy playing out every day in developing countries and in middle income countries, in the sense that there is this huge gradient of inequality when people abandon poorly performing public services, often for a very good reason. They are not performing, so they put their children to private schools. Um, the cheapest private schools available to the middle income and poorest people might not be very good. They might be formally private schools, but whether they actually learn anything there is another matter.
Hmm.
And the same applies to health service provision. It's very sad that basic health care isn't taken care of for large proportions of the population, and you can't drink tap water, things like that. Now, if that privatization goes on unchecked, it potentially creates very much more unequal societies, and it may also be that these societies end up paying a lot more for those services. So there's kind of a case to be made that if government is able to provide good quality public services, um, like if you're in Britain, if you're in US, you can pretty much put your child to a local public school and they will be fine in
For the
overwhelming
most part, yeah.
majority of the almost always. And you can drink the tap water. You can use the public health care. And now, when you have a sort of a long-term movement towards private sector, what happens is that education increasingly becomes a sort of a positional good, in a sense that what people are paying for is not just the education, but a position in a hierarchy. So the private schools are, for the mega rich people, upper middle class, different schools at every single range. And the price goes up exponentially. So the question is, basically you end up in a situation where everybody pays quite a lot for education. And it has often been shown that many of these private schools can't necessarily get these students to learn the core skills any more than the public schools. The basic numeracy, basic literacy, basic science, there's a sort of an upper limit to how you can develop your students. So what the more expensive private schools then do is they have massive theaters, sports facilities. They put lots of money on these sort of additional things. And the parents pay for that, of course, and they pay for the peer group and everything. So it becomes, for the society, it becomes potentially a lot more expensive way to educate children, and also a lot more unequal.
Hmm.
And what are the sort of long-term consequences of these things is who knows. the developing and emerging countries really want to think carefully how much they want to go down that road, or whether they want to fix their public services. And interestingly, the wealthiest countries, Europe, US, they keep their public services good. They keep them running. They think it's important. And as I've said, it's almost like a defining feature of a developing or emerging country that the public services don't run well.
Certainly.
So I think this is the big picture, and any research relating to this and the long-term consequences is potentially quite interesting.
No, certainly agreed. Panu, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on for the episode. Is there any sort of bits of research or other publications you would like to maybe point listeners to?
Well, the research that I've been talking about today is basically a project on Peru that was funded by British Academy. So thank you, British Academy, for funding. So this went on for a few years, and we have some outputs on our website. So you can Google up my name, my co-authors' names. You basically find these papers from our website. And of course, me and my many co-authors, we mostly work on education in developing countries and developed countries. So I've also recently been working on India, Mexico, and I have work on wealthier countries like Britain and Norway as well. So anybody who's interested in economics of education is always welcome to look up my work or email me and talk about common interest ideas.
Wonderful. Yeah, links will be down in the description below. Again, Panu, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.